Hey guys, we're going to continue from where we left off last time talking about the Crusades. And I'm just going to review once again our four main leaders for the First Crusade. So, our four main leaders of the First Crusade were Godfrey of Bouillon, the Duke of Lorraine from the Holy Roman Empire. The second one was Bohemond Terianto for the Duchy of Apulia, which is in southern Italy. Third one was Raymond of Toulouse from the Kingdom of France, and he was Count of Toulouse. And last was Robert of Flanders, Count of Flanders, also in the Kingdom of France. So that's who we were talking about last time. Those are our four main leaders. And we're going to continue our story from where we left off last time. Last time we were talking about our story. Crusaders made their way down from Nicaea, and they made their way over to Antioch. And at Antioch, the Crusaders were eventually able to take over the city before the arrival of the leader of the Turks, Kaboga, showed up. When Kaboga showed up, the Crusaders then defeated Kaboga in a battle outside the city walls. So that's what happened last time in our story. In today's story, we got Road to Jerusalem. Go ahead and make a bullet and write down Road to Jerusalem. So for the Road to Jerusalem, what ends up happening is that the Crusaders, they're sitting in Antioch, right? So they took over the city in June, and they defeated Kaboga on June 5th. And then they're sitting around in Antioch, and they're trying to decide what they're going to do. They're like, all right, we got to make a decision here about what we're going to do. And they couldn't come up with a decision. A lot of the problem came down to is that Bohemond, he didn't want to leave Antioch because he took over the city. And remember in the story that we talked about last time, he decided that, or not he decided, but he was able to get the other Crusade leaders to agree with them that if he was able to take over the city, then he could keep the city. So Bohemond, the city of Antioch is his. So he's in control of the city of Antioch, and he doesn't want to leave because, he wants to control the city and then take over the surrounding area. And the other Crusade leaders kind of want to get going, but they need supplies and so forth first, so they're trying to wait around for supplies. So they're sitting around in Antioch, so it's, June of 1098, and they're in Antioch. And then it's July, August, September, October, December, and January, they finally decide that, look, we got to name somebody as leader, and we got to get going. And when they got done discussing who should be leader, the person that ends up winning the vote is Raymond. Go ahead and make a 1 and write down Raymond is named Supreme Commander of the Crusading Forces. So they've been sitting around for Antioch for like 6 months. They finally they nominate Raymond. They elect him to be the Supreme Commander of the Crusading Forces. And then after he's elected as Supreme Commander of Crusading Forces, then they finally get going in January of 1099. However, Bohemond still isn't ready to go yet after 6 months. He decides that he's going to stay in Antioch, but he promises that he will join the Crusaders later. So Bohemond's like, hey, don't worry, I'll join you guys later. Very similar to Alexis Comnenus, who also promised the same thing, and then, also didn't show up. We'll see if Bohemond shows up or not later on the story. Go ahead and make a 2 and write down Bohemond stays in Antioch, but promises to join the Crusaders later. And while the Crusaders were hanging out in Antioch, the Egyptians were offering an alliance with the Crusaders. The Egyptians had been fighting a war against the Turks and Kaboga, and they offered the Crusaders an alliance with themselves, and they're like, hey, together we'll go fight against the Turks. And the Crusaders are like, oh, we just want Jerusalem, so let's give us the city. And the Egyptians are like, well, we took Jerusalem away from the Turks last year, so no. So the Crusaders shot down the alliance idea. So the Egyptians are actually the ones in control of Jerusalem, not the Turks. The Egyptians had taken that over in the early parts of 1098 from the Turks, which is part of the reason why the Crusaders were able to defeat their army so easily outside the city walls of Antioch, was because they had just lost to the Egyptians, and now the Egyptians are the ones that are in control of Jerusalem. So Egyptians won Jerusalem from the Turks, and then the Turks tried to fight against Crusaders, and didn't go very well. All right. Make a 3. So eventually, Jaffa, port city conquered by Crusaders. So make a 3. Write down Jaffa, port city conquered by Crusaders. I'll talk more about that in a bit, but go ahead and write that down for now. So 3, Jaffa, port city conquered by Crusaders. So once the Crusaders start leaving Antioch, when they start heading down the coastline towards Jerusalem. Any city they kind of come by, they basically tell them, hey, if you guys give us supplies, we'll leave you alone. If not, we'll destroy your village. So one of those examples of a village getting destroyed was El Naram. And in that city, the population decided not to give supplies to Raymond of Toulouse. Raymond then burnt down the entire city and killed everybody that was in the city, all 8,000 of them. So after that point, cities pretty much gave supplies to the Crusaders, so the Crusaders would leave them alone. So they just gave them supplies, and then the Crusaders left them alone as they continued down, marching down south towards Jerusalem. All right. So eventually, Crusaders do make it down to Jerusalem after they take over the city of Jaffa. The coast city of Jaffa is pretty important because it's right here. So that's the port city of Jaffa. That's important because that allows the Crusaders to get supplies that they can then send over land towards Jerusalem. But eventually, as I said, the Crusaders do make it to Jerusalem. Let's go ahead and make a bullet and write down the word Jerusalem. So make a bullet and write down the word Jerusalem. And after you have the bullet Jerusalem, let's write down the day on which the Crusaders are attacking the city, or sorry, what day they arrive at Jerusalem, which is on June 7th of 1099. So go ahead and make a 1 and write down June 7th, 1099. So the Crusaders have been fighting for quite a long time. They took over Nicaea in 1097, they took over Antioch in 1098, and now they're finally down Jerusalem in 1099. So it's been quite a long campaign. Now, most of the Crusaders that came along, the 35,000 at first, there's only about 15,000 Crusaders that are at Jerusalem once they finally get there. So they started off with 35,000. Now they're down to 15,000. Part of that is because Bohemond's troops are obviously in Antioch, and Baldwin has some troops over in Dessa. So that's a couple thousand right there. But they have lost probably half their forces due to desertions or death from the battles that they have fought. All right. So what ends up happening is that as soon as the Crusaders get to Jerusalem on that June 7th, they immediately decide that they're going to try to attack the city walls. Now, there's only about 1,000 Egyptians that are defending the city walls. You can see them right here in the picture, the city walls of Jerusalem. So they immediately try to attack the city walls of Jerusalem without any preparation. They don't have like ladders. Well, they don't have many ladders or anything. They don't really have the supplies, like that many supplies to attack the city, but they try to attack it right away. Needless to say, it doesn't go very well, and they're not able to take over the city on the very first day. So their first attempt to take over the city, like right away as soon as they got there, without any prep work, didn't go very well. And then, the Crusaders are a bit discouraged, and that's all of a sudden when there's a new vision comes to an errant priest, because Peter Bartholomew is somewhat dead from burns. So then another priest has another vision, and in his vision, the Crusaders need to march around the walls of Jerusalem barefoot, while blowing some horns and so forth and trumpets. That will cause, according to the priest, will cause then the walls to fall on down. All right, so this is from the story of the walls of Jericho. And the walls of Jericho, people kind of march around the city walls and they blow a horn that causes the walls to fall down. So the Crusaders end up marching around the city as well, barefoot around the city of Jerusalem while blowing some horns. It did prove to be pretty ineffective. However, because the soldiers were kind of busy around the city walls of Jerusalem, it did give them something to do. And while they're busy doing that, a boat arrives in Jaffa that's carrying a whole bunch of wood. And then the Crusaders use that wood at the port city of Jaffa. They bring it over to Jerusalem. And then they can start constructing some siege towers. Go ahead and make it 2. And write down 3 siege towers were built. And remember, siege towers were these big towers on wheels as tall as a city wall that you would roll up to the city wall, and then there'd be like a little like drawbridge on top of it that you could drop onto the city walls, and then you could then get your soldiers on top of the city walls. Okay, so they made 3 of the siege towers for our 3 remaining leaders that were at Jerusalem. Remember, Bohemond is still in Antioch, so our 3 leaders that are left there at the city of Jerusalem were Godfrey, Raymond, and Robert were our 3 leaders. So each one of them had a wall built, constructed for them. So what ends up happening is once the 3 siege towers were constructed, on July 15th, the Crusaders finally made their move on trying to take over Jerusalem. So they finally make their move to take over Jerusalem. and they split up their towers into 3 different parts. So they have their 3 different towers moving towards the city walls of Jerusalem, and they're all in kind of different sections. And Godfrey had actually moved his siege tower during the nighttime to a different position, so that way in the morning he had a different position, so the garrison wasn't at the position where they thought he was going to be at. So he moved it during nighttime, so they weren't in the same place as his tower was going to be at. So the 3 towers, bam, they start moving them on July 15th in the morning towards the city walls. While they're rolling up to the city walls, Raymond Toulouse's tower, he gets that stuck in a ditch, so he didn't really scout ahead, so his got like stuck in a ditch. And then Robert's siege tower ends up getting shot with some flaming arrows, so it catches on fire. But Godfrey is able to dock his siege tower against the city walls, and once he's able to dock against the city walls, he's able to get his troops out, and he's able to take over the city wall section. He's able to get the gates open. And once he gets able to get the gates open, that's pretty much it. And the Crusaders are able to kind of rush in. Now, the Crusaders did not treat this battle very kindly. What I mean by that, as soon as they got inside the city of Jerusalem, they just slaughtered everybody. Let's go ahead and we're going to write down what day this happened on. Make a number 3, if you would, please. And write down July 15th, 1099. The Crusaders stormed the city. And they do end up massacring the entire population. Women, men, children. Didn't really matter. Killed them all. And the reason why they wiped out the entire population of the city was, 1, because their entire goal was to take over Jerusalem. And 2, another reason for it as well was because anybody who was Christian that was in the city of Jerusalem had gotten kicked out by the Egyptians because the Egyptians knew that a Christian had betrayed the city of Antioch. So because of that, they kicked out anyone who was Christian out of the city already. So the Crusaders just wiped out the entire population because, well, none of them were Christians. All right, everybody. So once you're set with that, let's go on to our next one. So Crusaders are now in control of Jerusalem. So you're like, oh, hey, sweet. So the first Crusade's done. They've taken over Jerusalem. Well, not quite. You see, the Egyptians weren't very happy about the Crusaders attacking their city of Jerusalem that the Egyptians controlled. So they had an army of 20,000 they put together, and they had sent them up to Ascalon, which is pretty close to Jerusalem on the coastline. They had sent them up to Ascalon, and that army was preparing to march on Jerusalem. And the king of the Egyptians was there as well, El Afdal, known as the Excellent King. This is the flag here for the Egyptians at the time period. So the Egyptians have shown up in force with 20,000 troops, and we know the Crusaders had 15,000 when they're at Jerusalem. They don't have as many now, though, because of their attempts to take our city walls. So after the battle for Jerusalem, there's about 1,200 knights that the Crusaders have left, about 900 infantrymen, and about another 900 peasants that are left. So they're down to about 11,000 troops that they have remaining against the 20,000 that the Egyptians brought with them. And the Crusaders had a couple ideas. They could either stay in Jerusalem and try to defend the city, or they could go march out and meet the Egyptians in battle. The Crusaders decided that instead of staying in the city of Jerusalem, they would go march out and meet them at Ascalon. So the Crusaders march out and they go to Ascalon. And at the Battle of Ascalon, you have Godfrey. He's on the left wing. Basically, he's on the very left side of the army. Raymond is on the very right-hand side of the army. And then Tancred, remember, he was related to Bohemond. He's in the center, along with Robert of Sanders. So Robert of Flanders is also up in the center as well. And what's up happening at the Battle of Ascalon is the Egyptians, they're kind of preparing to march towards Jerusalem. And all of a sudden, the Crusaders just kind of showed up. And the Egyptians hadn't been scouting around because they didn't think the Crusaders would just show up out of nowhere. They thought they were staying in Jerusalem. So the Crusaders just kind of showed up at Ascalon. And as soon as the Crusaders just kind of showed up, they just immediately smashed the Egyptians with a heavy cavalry charge. It broke up the lines of the Egyptians. And then the Crusaders then proceeded to kind of just smash into them with their infantry. That was it for the entire battle. So the Egyptian forces are caught by surprise. The Crusaders win the battle at Ascalon. The Crusader losses are light, probably a couple hundred, while the Egyptians lose somewhere between 10 to 12,000 troops. Go ahead and make a 4, if you would, please. And we're going to write down number 4. The Crusaders win at the Battle of Ascalon. So write that down for number 4. So Now that the Turks have been defeated, with Kaboga defeated, and now the Egyptians have been defeated as well, the territory that the Crusaders took over, Jerusalem and Antioch and Edessa, are secure, and the Crusaders will kind of expand. Well, most Crusaders at this point in time consider the vows complete and they head home, but a few of them do stay around and they expand out their territory a bit in the area. Let's go ahead and make a new bullet and write down why was the First Crusade successful. So make a bullet and write down why was the First Crusade successful. So there's two main reasons why the First Crusade was successful in taking over Antioch and Jerusalem and gaining control over the Holy Lands. And the first reason is, so we're going to make a number one, surprise! Large army out of nowhere. So the first reason why it was successful was because a large army just showed up out of nowhere. When you have 35,000 troops or people that just kind of show up, that's a pretty huge force. As we talked about before, 10 to 20,000 would be a pretty large force, and having more than that is pretty enormous. So just having a large army just show up out of nowhere was quite a surprise to the Celtic Turks as well as the Egyptians. And then for two, a war between the Celtic Turks and the Egyptians. So two, war, equal sign, between the Celtic Turks and Egyptians. The second reason why it was successful was because the Celtic Turks and Egyptians had already been beating up on each other, and they were both already in a weakened state. They had been fighting over Jerusalem before the Crusaders showed up, and therefore both their forces were weakened, and a lot of troops they had were either raw recruits or because of other issues that had happened, people were very unwary of fighting in the Celtic Turk side since they had just lost the Egyptians. He didn't have a lot of loyalty of his troops, and they just immediately bailed on him at the Battle of Antioch. And as I said, then with the Egyptians, it was a lot of fresh troops they had just recruited. All right, so that's it for today's notes.